Stay on this topic, and as the world battles with the fight against COVID-19, some say the day activities have to continue. Businesses have started opening up, and schools are expected to resume in the next month in South Africa. No doubt academic activities have been delayed with lockdown put in place to curb the spread of the virus. We're now joined via Skype by Learning Specialist Paul Tosio to look into some ways students can thrive through this pandemic. A very good afternoon to you, sir. Thank you so very much for agreeing to speak to us here on SABC News.
Thank you for calling, Flo. Afternoon.
Just as a start, we just had the story now talking about the reopening of schools. As a learning specialist, what do you make of that decision to have some of the grades resume classes now on the 1st of June?
Well, there are at least two components to this, obviously. From a straightforward educational point of view, we all understand that there's an urgency to get people in contact with teachers as soon as possible. And I know that a lot of the teachers are itching to get back into the classroom to try and help students as much as they can at the moment. But of course, that being said, it's not that simple because there's a public health component to this as well. So the fear of increased infection and so on. And this is serious because, of course, Cambridge University, for instance, has suspended their live lectures until the middle of next year. Schools that I work with in Dubai, for instance, have closed until the beginning of their academic year in September. Yeah. But given that we're working on a very different calendar in South Africa, I think that the government's phased-in approach is quite a sensible one. Starting with grades 12 and 7 means that you've got two grades who are more mature, and you've also got two grades for whom the academic importance of the year is that much heightened. So I suppose what I would say to the students particularly is that there's a social responsibility that you now carry to make sure that you maintain distance and you practice proper hygiene. Because, of course, we are a country where many households are led by people with comorbidities or who are elderly. So, for instance, when you get home from school, please make sure that you wash your hands with soap as quickly as possible. And balancing those two things seems key. The public health is important, but getting the students learning is also important. And I'm pleased with the government's phased-in approach.
Last week I had a conversation with a learner, a very articulate young lady, not a learner who doesn't like school or anything like that. And, she made the argument, and I know that some have also been making that argument, that maybe the academic year could have been cancelled. You're talking about Dubai only starting, to reopen schools in September. I wonder what's your view on that mind frame?
Look, it's quite an interesting one. The first thing I would say is that I disagree with the idea of cancelling the academic year. Now, whether or not that means that students return to class is an entirely different issue. Yeah. But I've been working with schools all around the world who are now working in an online manner very differently. And we've got to remember that there's some precedent to disaster closing schools, and yet there not necessarily being an academic downfall as a result. The obvious example which pops to mind is that in 2011, there was, of course, the earthquake in Christchurch. That meant that schools were closed for weeks, in some cases months. But by the end of the year, people found that the academic results that students were handing in were actually improved. They didn't decrease, they increased, because if a student recognizes that their education is actually fundamentally their responsibility, and they don't export that responsibility to a teacher, they can actually do quite well, better than if they assume that the teacher is the primary person who's going to do the work for them. I'm often asked in interview, if you can give one bit of advice to help students improve their results, what would it be? And I say I can answer that very easily. Yeah. Pretend like you don't have any teachers.
Yeah. And just on that note, many parents have sort of had this negative view that lockdown and the closure of schools is, of course, a major disruption to schooling and learning. But, of course, as you mentioned, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So how do we see it then as perhaps maybe even a positive in some respects? You mentioned the fact that you can actually see this in a different way. We all know when we move from school to varsity that the difference in teacher involvement was quite big, and you kind of had to, kind of swim, or sink, So I wonder how, younger students that are used to having that teacher babying them, how must we then see it in a positive light?
Well, Flo, I think what you've said is absolutely brilliant, because the whole point is that often when people get to university, agency is given to the student, and it's now presumed that they have to swim. And a number of students suddenly perform better because they realize that now the task is up to me. And I mean, I know that when I was in high school, I used to more or less, I'm exaggerating slightly, think that it was the geography teacher's job to download all the information into my mind.
Yeah.
So that by the time I left in 40 minutes' time, you had better tell me how a tropical cyclone forms. But when I got to university, that changed, because I realized, no, I have to try and learn this as well as possible myself. So I'd like to give a bit of practical advice for students, because not only the students, but of course the parents are wondering, how can we catch up after these couple of months? Now, when I in interviews say, pretend like you have no teachers, often an interviewer will say, but how, Paul? How? They don't even know what's important. How on earth can a student say what they've got to learn? Now, fortunately, textbooks almost always tell you what is important on the very first page of a chapter. There's literally a table called Educational Aims, Learning Outcomes. By the end of the chapter, the student should be able to. You all know what page it is, students, because it's the one where you go, oh, thank heaven, something I don't need to read. And you turn the page over.
Yeah.
Now, that page is your friend, because for once it's telling you this is what's important. Those people who suddenly did better in New Zealand, by the way, the same thing was found in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Students sometimes saw huge improvement in results, because the teaching was done in a way that said, please focus on the 6 core things, not the 5,000 frilly facts, but what are the things that you really need to know and understand. And so this is what people must do. Whenever you see that table, turn each of those items into a question, go and get the perfect answer for that question, write it out, and memorize it. If you do that, it means that you're a much more purposeful student, and you're focusing on the core ideas without being bogged down in the frilly stuff. If you really start doing that practically, this year could be the best academic year for students, because it means that they learn some of those valuable lessons in self-autonomy that is normally only learned in first year.
Yeah, Paul, it's been such a great pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so very much for giving us your time. That's a Learning Specialist Paul Tosio. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Flo. Have a wonderful day, and everyone keep safe.
Same to you. All right.